Hello everyone and welcome to the public space. We will be reviewing the bell curve video by Shaun. I'll be giving my comments about the bell curve in general also. Welcome people of the regular chat. Someone was asking, why does JF block those who successfully counter his argument? Get ready guys. Sub minus 130. Dr. Gary P is about to deny or contradict the value of right tail IQ scores again. If I've blocked you, it's probably not because you came to me with a good argument. I can block for misrepresentations. If you lie about my position, sometimes I will block. Not all the times, but sometimes when I do a scientific argument and people come to me with stuff I haven't said, I'm going to block you. So it's probably this, or you may have been insulting or other things if you troll me or insult me on my personal life. This is the kind of thing you'll get. John Doe says, you've blocked me after I proved the IQ above 145. If you think you can prove your IQ above 145 on Twitter, you're probably deserving of a block and you're probably a highly deluded man. That being said, he says, no, I defeated you. Alright dude, start your own YouTube channel. You're so brilliant. Just make your argument, destroy me, and maybe one day you can reach my level of YouTubing. And I can't block you at that time. You'll be the one blocking me. Good luck. That guy S says, Jeff, you should get Shaun last and all type on this show together. I'm not talking to all type anymore. Someone was wondering if all type has done a response. He has done a 10-minute short response. Maybe he will do a more complete response later, but for now, he's been publishing audio recordings of Shaun, showing that Shaun has actually engaged in the creation of this video with deceptive intent. He admits I don't know if the discussion was private or if it was a stream, but he admits in another conversation that he designed the video so that you could spend the first 50 minutes not knowing his position, and so that essentially his goal is inherently subversive. He wanted to bring a crowd that would potentially agree with the bell curve and then hit them with the big arguments. Well, we will see. There is not much interesting arguments in this entire 2 hours, 40 minutes video. It's going to be a long one tonight. Get strapped. Bias towards truth says, JF, how should I invest $100,000? You should donate them to me in the form of Bitcoin, sir. The Bitcoin address for donation is in the description below. What's a better investment than maintaining a public space forever? Always bringing you constant information and entertainment. Join us on Entropy tonight if you want to send me questions or super chats. It's my favorite platform, and the question tonight is, do you agree more with Shaun or JF? Of course, it is a biased survey. Because it is my crowd and it is on my channel, but it's good to know whether you guys agree with his argument. So perhaps we can start with the bell curve, what it means, and because the Shaun video is essentially a divided in 3 parts. The first is a good cop. So he quotes the bell curve and it's like, see, it's not so racist. And I'm like, okay, Shaun is not doing well. When I see a 2-hour, 40 minutes video and the first 50 minutes video is just him fairly representing his opponent, I'm like, Shaun is not doing good. My Shaun has been feeling bad. Maybe he has a cough, maybe AIDS, I don't know. But there's clearly something going wrong. And of course, the mask slips. The mask slips. Of course, the second section is him pinpointing little details. You should have been careful, because if you're like, if I show you this, here's my problem. If I show you this is the global IQ of nations, alright? To illustrate what Shaun is doing for the second part of his video, he's saying, maybe this one we're not sure. Maybe this one was biased. Maybe this one is because of white supremacy. I swear to God, he's essentially questioning the specific recordings in about 3 nations total. I don't know if I'm totally aligned on the countries he's criticized, but his argument for the second part revolves around Nigeria, maybe our measures are not correct, Zambia, maybe our measures are not correct, and South Africa, our original measures may have not been correct, but maybe even the new measures are still biased because there's lots of white supremacy there. And I'm like, okay, suppose that these parts of the world, suppose we ignore this. What is your statement on the other countries, Shaun? What is your statement about the Caribbean? What is your statement about those countries? What is your statement about those countries? It's so pinpointed that you can see the ridicule here when you look at the entire map. It is insufficient to be contesting the view that there are IQ differences and that they vary across the world. That IQ, suppose we were to say there's other types of intelligence not captured by IQ. All right, let's put it on the side. IQ measures something, and this thing varies across the nations. And even if we were wrong, as he claims, about 3 countries' precise measures, Shaun doesn't come with an alternative measurement. Shaun doesn't have an alternative hypothesis. And so we have to conclude that Shaun largely agrees with the decades of work that have led to this map. And as we will see, even his little criticism are not solid enough to even question the measures of these countries being within the expected parameters, within what you see also around the countries. And of course, there's the classical example of Ethiopia. If you want to claim that white colonialism in Africa has been oppressing people, all right, possible. But then there are countries of Africa that were not colonized. There are also people of these countries that have lived intergenerationally in elsewhere, and so, for example, the Caribbean, and people in all nations in the end. And so the case for IQ varying across the world and varying between populations is quite strong. And it's not even the main point of the bell curve. So let's start without the and the third part of Shaun's video is about politics and eugenics. And then he goes full, they are funded by Nazis, and ultimately, all of these funding entities are remnants of the German Nazi Party and associates. The thing is, this would not change the facts identified. The facts come from an array of scientists. We literally have now reviews and books just cataloging all IQ studies ever done in all nations, and they come from different researchers. So if you have an argument that is based solely on guilt of association because some guys was in the Nazi Party and then he was friend with this one and then he was the nephew of the scientist who eventually discovers something, it's like, all right, in IQ science, we can discard about as many studies as you want. It's like, okay, how many studies do you have a problem with? 100, 1,000, 100,000, we can put them on the side. What about what's left? That is what we need to tell Shaun. And as far as the third part of the video of Shaun, in its attack of eugenics and everything, it lacks an appreciation of the fact that we are in a eugenic society. It's like you can argue all you want against the bell curve. You can say it's not the right direction to go. But you can't deny that our current programs are eugenic. They are eugenic in a certain direction. We are helping people live, breathe, and survive. To that extent, any society is eugenic. The question is not so much should we be eugenic. The question is, since every society is eugenic, should we take consciousness of it so that we're able to make better decisions about it? And ultimately, do we want an institutionalized form of eugenic, or do we want the natural forms of eugenic that come from nature? Spoiler alert, current society is institutionalized eugenics. The way the state intervenes in people's reproductive life, the way the state funds opportunities for abortion, for birth pills, for medications, and social welfare. It is a highly eugenic and highly institutionalized world we live in. And so it is a false choice, the choice between the bell curve, the eugenist, or us. Because we are the eugenist, really. And taking the direction of the bell curve, ironically, I would say, because of the way the bell curve is being represented as evil, taking the direction of the bell curve would actually restore a little bit of, instead of being institutionalized eugenic, it would come back to the rules of nature and everyone for himself, and a little bit less state control on our lives. So the bell curve, what is it? The bell curve is a very balanced book, impressively balanced, and it is a book that bumps into an assumption of the academia that had been going on since decades before they wrote the book, and that is still going on. That is still the main take in social sciences, I would argue. And it is this conception that the environment influences outcomes. And it is the working assumption of most of social science still as of today. And in that sense, the bell curve is a book that has failed at its intellectual revolution, but not because it was false, not because it didn't make the right arguments, but because people are too stupid. Academia is too close-minded and too uninterested in taking this direction to realize the truth of this book. The truth of this book is trying to confront modern academia to an idea that there are natural variations in people's capacities, that our biological constitution, our brain, our cognition, our IQ, is influencing the way societies develop and the way we develop as individuals, that there are parts of this that will be essentially unchangeable other than through genetic modification. It's not explicitly mentioned in the book, but right now we can see now that we can do genetic modification, that genes are changeable. The question is, do we want to? All right, John Doe, I have banned you on Twitter for your poor arguments. I will ban you now on YouTube for attacking my personal life. Get fucked, sir. You're the one trying to insult me on a regular chat. You loser. I enjoy the big life, and the elements that you criticize from my life, I enjoy them. I'm living the good life. YouTuber, successful, everything that you've ever wanted to be. Goodbye, sir. The bell curve is also an appeal to be interested in the division, the class structure of intelligence, as they say in the subtitle. It's essentially an appeal to, understand that the way society works, it will divide people into classes at different levels. Some of them are economic, some of them are in terms of poverty, in terms of nutrition, but it brings forth this idea that cognitive classes are something we should care about and understand. And that part I agree with. It goes further than this, and this may be the biggest disagreement I have with the bell curve, because it's not a book that I will defend word for word. It's not a book that I fully agree with everything stated. It's a book that is worth criticizing, but for its real defect, not for what Shaun identifies in it. The big defect of the bell curve is this prediction of cognitive class separation in America going forward. I would argue that it didn't happen. It didn't happen the way they predicted it. The way they predicted this is, look, money is so correlated to intelligence. People are working together in the workplace, and then they're fucking, and then they're making babies, and then they're pairing with people they meet in school or in the workplace. They predicted essentially that there would be a class separation that would be hard, where the 125 IQ people will hang together, fuck together, reproduce together, and they predicted largely that this class separation would be non-racial. That is, in the view of Charles Murray and Einstein, we would be in a situation where the high IQ blacks, the high IQ Asians, the high IQ whites would all be together in a garden, discussing intellectual stuff, while the less intelligent people of the world would be together at the bar, yelling at each other and fighting and making babies. It didn't happen. And I think that this book fundamentally and ironically, because it's often criticized for being racist, when in fact race is a secondary subject, and I would argue an instrumentalized subject of this book. In other words, this book is not about race and IQ. And it's not about understanding IQ differences between the races for genetic and biological reasons. They just touch on the subject because they think, all right, maybe we can do an argument with race and IQ. It's not about race and IQ. They're trying to make an argument about biological inheritance, and it's true that the race and IQ stuff helps you reinforce the case of genetic control of intelligence. But they don't do it with this being the end of the argument in mind. They just see race and IQ as demonstrating further that there is biological inheritance of IQ. But what this book fundamentally misses is the racial aspect of dating, of segregation, and it misses it solidly. That's why their prediction is wrong in the end. This is why their prediction is wrong right here. The OkCupid racial preference patterns. Stable across years. You can see this is 2009, 2010, 2011. 2009 as a case graph. Men rating women. Asian men rate Asian women 11% more. Black women 16% less. Latina women at 0% approximately. And white women at 7%. This shows the bias. So you have to take the 0 point here as being unbiased. At the 0% point, you are on the average, and If you tend to have preferences for whites or Asians, it will show as green. If you tend to have less preferences for outside your race, it will show as red. So Asian men, they have a preference for Asian women, white women, pretty much. Black men are equally interested in women of all races. I mean, not equally, but their bias is much less important, -3% for black women. People have been saying, wow, JF, that is surprising. Yes, black men discriminate against black women slightly on the dating website. Latino men, they are approximately equally interested in Asians and Latina, and slightly more interested in white. White men are, above all, most interested in white women. Women rating men. Asian women have a bias for Asian men or white men, slightly rating the white man higher. Black women are mostly interested in black men. Latina women are interested in either Latino men or white men equally. And white women have a vast preference for white men. This is not going away. We're just talking about the dating preferences. Most of these relationships will not result with marriage. It becomes worse when you look just at marriage. Looking at this study on marriage, transition from singlehood to marriage, white male, 95% picking white spouses. Only less than 1% black and 4% Hispanic. White females, same thing. About 95% picking white males. Black males, 91% choosing black spouses. Hispanic male, 78% choosing Hispanic and 16% choosing white partners. So this is what the bell curve has missed. The bell curve has missed how cognitive structure is not so important to the world, and this, the dating patterns across races, that is what reveals most of the powerful explanations about the state of the world, about where we are headed, about the divisions between classes. Beside these numbers, predictions by IQ are like, they're like a little bug flying in the room. Torrin McCabe says, Shaun's debunk is so previous year. YouTube has evolved from SJW debunk, nitpicking, and guilt by association to people making positive claims about the world. His video is worse than Star Wars. Well said. It is painful to go through this, and yes, it does give a taste of previous times of YouTube. Staunch Monarchist says, what are your thoughts on the Duluth model? Does this give an overall net benefit to all people in society? The Duluth model, is that the buffet? Is that serving food all you can eat? Duluth model, or Domestic Abuse Intervention Project, is a program developed to reduce domestic violence against women. It is named after Duluth, Minnesota, a city where it was developed. As of 2006, the Duluth model is the most common batterer intervention program used in the U.S. Critics argue that the method can be ineffective as it was developed without minority communities in mind and can fail to address root psychological and emotional causes of abuse. I'm trying to get to a point where they would explain what it is. Okay, this is a course, so batterers who complete programs based on the Duluth model are less likely to repeat acts of domestic violence than those who do not complete any batterer's intervention program. Response rates were low, many people dropped out of the programs, and victims could not be found for subsequent interviews. I'm not surprised. The big secret of social science is that there's not as many victims as they would want it to be. So no, I haven't seen the details of the program, but I vastly disagree with any program in application, any form of state intervention in the male and female relationship other than criminal investigation. I am against partners committing crimes against each other. I am for the police to be intervening and investigating. And when there is not enough evidence to reach the criminal threshold, that is, convincing a jury beyond reasonable doubt that an act of assault of any kind has been occurring, then I am for saying whatever it is that happened is not a crime, so it is a civil issue. And by civil issue, I don't mean that there should be civil courts for this or anything. I mean, it's an issue between two citizens, and it's a disagreement. That is my position. Oscar Giotto says, JF, 2 years ago, Shaun completely destroyed by a /poll user. Here's the link. Well, I don't have time to review that kind of stuff. Today, we are reviewing his video, and we're getting started right now. Alright. I have about 40 timestamps. This will be a long one. I'm not showing the first 36 minutes of his video because Shaun doesn't say anything in there that is revealing his position. He's just quoting the bell curve, so be it. Rockshot says, Jeff, are you saying you were never at the making babies? What are you talking about? I make babies all the time. Bias towards truth says, why can JF talk about this, but he banned me for talking about phenotypic differences between races? That's because you don't master the YouTube rules and exactly how to phrase your stuff. You should never phrase stuff that could be interpreted by a third party as being a mockery of any kind. But to specify, it's good that you bring the subject because it's a good time to specify this. The goal of this video is a scientific understanding of the characteristics of cognition and diversity around the world. It is not intended for discrimination, and it is not intended for mocking anyone. It is a scientific characterization and a factual one of the state of the world, the state of society, and the cognitive diversity that we can find in it. That is a message for the YouTube censors. Alright, let's get started. So we start with some explanations about statistics that are not deeply wrong, but that are just slightly skewed to misguide the audience into convincing the audience that it has heard more than it has really heard. Because you can nitpick and you can say, we're not sure about this, and here's a situation where... And if you don't apply this specifically to the context of IQ, these statistical concerns, they are not very interesting. But you can say, here's a fundamental way in which twin studies, we are uncertain about their results. But if you cannot tell me where is it and how is it that the IQ studies quoted in the bell curve are quoted by me, how is it that they fit this statistical weakness? For now, we're in the fundamental statistical comments of Shaun. So let's have a look. He starts by explaining that correlation does not explain why variables vary.
And factor analysis here. Well, first of all, factor analysis tells us nothing about causation. It deals with correlations. It can show that there might be common factors underlying different variables, but it does not identify for us why those variables vary. As a comparison here, let's say you take a sample of 10,000.
So this point does not matter, because the bell curve is not trying to get into the nitty-gritty of the causes. Once you understand that the goal of the bell curve is not to demonstrate a particular cause, but rather to just find attain a description of the current state of society in IQ, and the relationship between the various variables that we care about in society. Once you understand this, you understand that even if they had not proved without the shadow of a doubt a given cause and its percentage of contribution to observed outcomes, it wouldn't matter. Now they do approach this subject, and their ballpark estimation is essentially genetics must influence IQ between 40 and 80%. And it's amazing how it is still a valid number today. It hasn't changed. I think that you'd find very few people today still arguing that it's 40%. You find close to no one in this field that would claim that it's zero, that genes don't influence intelligence. So if you understand this, you understand that there's much we can say about society, there's much we can understand about ourselves, and there's much we can even decide to do politically by knowing that it's somewhere in that range. On top of it, I would argue, you can intervene in society even if it's not the genes. You can care about environmental contributions to IQ too. So that's the first comment. Of course, correlation does not explain why variables vary, but it doesn't matter. It's a start at looking at the world.
Random members of the public, and you test their athletic performance at various physical tests. Amount of weight lifted, length jumped, speed at running various distances, sit-ups completed, whatever. And let's say that what you find is that people who perform well on one test relative to the group tend to perform well on the other tests relative to the group, and vice versa for those who perform poorly. Now you could, if you so fancied, subject this data to factor analysis. Identify numerically the most important underlying factor and name it F for general fitness or something. And you could probably further assign each person an FQ or fitness quotient. However, what you would not have done is explain why some people are fitter than others. You would have said...
So, this is not a claim by the bell curve. So we're in Strawman territory here. The bell curve doesn't say, look, there's a G factor in intelligence studies, therefore it's genetic. No, there's no such claim in the bell curve. The reason why the G factor is considered to be genetic is a series of evidence involving parental adoption, parental-child comparisons, twin studies, adoption studies. This is what allows you to conclude it's not the factor analysis itself. So Shaun is still throwing his crowd in the wrong direction here, giving them an argument that does not apply to any statement in the bell curve.
And speaking of genetics, let's next talk about the word heritability. When the bell curve says cognitive ability is substantially heritable, apparently no less than 40% and no more than 80%, what does that mean exactly? If we average it for 60% like they do, are we therefore to assume that each person's individual IQ is 60% determined by heritable genetics and 40% by the environment? Well, no.
Well, yes, on average. It's like you were missing one word. It's on average. On average, that is spread throughout the population, there is a sum of differences. If you boil down to these differences could be explained by hypothesis A, irritable, or hypothesis B, not irritable. And yes, ultimately, when we say 60% of the variance explained, you can divide it by the population, and you can say that your difference from the mean, from the perspective of an individual, your difference from the mean will be 60% explained on average by irritable factors and 40% by non-irritable factors.
Irritability is unfortunately one of those awkward words which has a common use understanding and a scientific understanding which differ in a few important ways. The common use understanding is something like the ability of a thing to be passed down genetically, right? You can inherit being tall.
Well, we recognize, I don't know that people use the word heritable only in the genetic sense. I think that even laymen understand that you can inherit wealth, that you can inherit culture, and certainly these things, although they use pods of genetics, they use my brain, which was created by DNA, to transfer to some other brain. I think it's generally acknowledged that it is not only through genetic replication that you can pass something to the next generation. So even the common understanding of the word, I think Shaun gets it wrong here.
Or having red hair, but you can't inherit a scar or a finger lost in an accident, say. The technical academic meaning.
But you can inherit wealth, you can inherit, in theory, a depth. You can inherit culture, and all these things are non-genetic.
Of heritability is rather different. Heritability is a numerical concept used to estimate the contribution of genetic variance to overall variance of a trait within a group. So basically, heritability estimates the degree to which the variance of a trait within a group is due to genetics.
Well, not in all studies. This is typically what you'll have in a twin study. They will frame it that way. They will try specifically to identify the genetic contribution. That being said, people in studies talk of heritability in much more general fashion. You can just Google heritability of political preferences and you'll have people just measure, okay, if the father and mother are Republicans, how much chance do I have that the child will be Republican? And these users of heritability do not take for granted that it must pass through the gene. So you have to be careful here. It's not all studies that are using definitions the way Shaun uses them. People are very much aware that there are ways to measure heritability in non-genetic fashions and without having any insight into the genetic part of the contribution. Heritability is the continuation between one generation and another, period.
Height is thus a heritable trait. Taller parents will generally have taller offspring, for example, and this is measurable against a population group. Having two arms, however, is not a heritable trait, because almost everyone has two arms, and for people who don't have two arms, that variance is usually environmental in nature.
Well, that's because it's an event that happens so rarely. That being said, you can have an instance where you have some injuries. They are not passed on genetically. However, the parents are passing some intrepid behavior, some risky behavior to their children through genes, and eventually you'll get more injuries in the children too. So you can have irritability without the feature being measured be directly passed on, directly copied between genetically related people. Alright, he's going to go on to another example, the earring example, which I don't think is very good either, but let's listen to what he has to say.
Genes and be very lowly heritable, such as the presence of arms, and also the inverse.
That guy S says, having two arms is 100% irritable. I thought, well, the sense in which he was using it is, suppose a society where everyone has two arms except a very small minority of people who accidentally lose their arms. And so in that society, your parent has arms, but you have a car accident and you lose your arms. He would say, well, that is due to the environment, essentially. So although the arms are genetically underlied, the structure of the arm is created by genes, ultimately the fact of losing the arm is determined by the environment. It depends on whether you had a car accident or not. That was his sense. Now let's hear a similar example with earrings.
Of that, a trait could be very highly heritable and not directly genetically determined. One common example used to illustrate this is earrings. What would we say accounts for the variance in whether people wear earrings within a particular group? Well, depending on the group, most of the variance could be due, in one sense, to a genetic factor, biological sex. Wearing earrings would therefore be a heritable trait, but this does not mean that there is an earring gene that is being passed down generationally. The majority of people wearing earrings being women would be due to...
So Ari slides on the straw man here. He was correct up to there. But he says that doesn't mean that the earring genes has been passed down intergenerationally. Well, the same could be said of intelligence. There's ways you can care about intelligence, and intelligence being genetically caused, while acknowledging that there is not a gene for intelligence. This whole strawman of let's find the gene, there's no gene for race, or there's no gene for earring. This is all beside the track of anything said in the bell curve. And the example of earrings, even in the case that he presents, which is that males are starting to wear earrings, it wouldn't be surprising that there is a genetic cause underlying this. It could be that more feminine men are more attracted to this, or it could be that there are genes that make you care about how you look and make you care about the bling bling and stuff like this. It's not a clear example to me that is non-genetic in nature. That being said, those are just theoretical considerations unrelated to anything in the bell curve. He then pulls a false categorization, which is direct and indirect genetic effects. Let's put it clear so that people understand what we're talking about. Everything in biology is indirect in terms of genetic effect, other than the transfer between DNA to RNA. And even at that point, there are some things going on that are modifying the RNA and chopping it and cutting it, but you never have a direct genetic effect. Even if something happens in your body due to an hormone produced by DNA, that there were stages. The DNA had to live in a cell, there had to be sugar for energy, there had to be a process of translation, transcription, production of the hormone, release into the blood. All of this relied on you eating apples and steak. There is no such thing as a direct genetic effect or indirect, but Shaun introduces this so he can give himself some leeway about stating stuff about, see, this is not a direct genetic effect. He's creating a false standard of proof.
Careful about exactly what we mean. A useful categorization here is direct versus indirect genetic determination. We need to be sure to differentiate between things that are directly genetically determined, as in your genes are directly causing some biochemical process to happen within you, and things...
See, he arbitrarily defines that direct will be some arbitrary chemical process, but all of your behaviors ultimately rely on arbitrary chemical process. I mean, by definition, they're really not arbitrary. They are very meaningful. There's a reason why it's these processes rather than some other. But there is no limit at which something becomes too indirect to be the subject of evolution or genetic inference.
Things that are indirectly genetically determined as a result of your genes interacting with your environment. Women being more likely to wear earrings, for instance.
The thing is, there is no genetic effects where there is no interaction with the environment. You just start with the fact that for our organism to even exist, we had to be provided with energy. We had to be kept at a certain temperature. We had to have certain amounts of food with specific nutrients. Nothing is independent of the environment. But it creates this false idea that, the further away you're from the gene, the more there's these gene-environment interaction. The reality is nothing does not interact with the environment.
For instance, is a heritable trait, but it is not directly genetically determined. This is relevant to us because IQ could be such a trait, where differences in IQ across designated racial groups are caused not by a direct genetic process, but instead by how our genetically determined characteristics interact with our environment so as to affect our results on IQ.
Doesn't matter. Evolution applies to environment-gene interactions, as we call them, in the same way it applies to any part of the phenotype, no matter how chemical and how simple it is. So this distinction is not useful. Let's move to 4440.
Something being heritable does not necessarily mean it is actually being directly caused by genetics. My next point is that heritability estimates the causes of variance within a group. It cannot tell us about reasons for differences across groups. And
that's a slight overstatement. It is a statement that is true in the context of twin studies specifically. Irritability in twin studies cannot be evaluated across groups for the simple reason that any two twins are by definition of the same race. They will either be two white twins, two black twins, or two mixed twins, but they will be equally mixed. There is really no way to study from a twin study perspective the precise difference between the IQs of blacks and whites and Asians. That's because we don't have pairs of babies that are multiracial other than they are equally multiracial, so it doesn't give us contrast. That being said, there are other ways we can study the irritability of intelligence. One of these, for example, is trans-racial adoption studies. So if you claim that there's something in the white environment that is increasing IQ, just take a baby from another race who lost his parent and place them in the white family. And you'll get an estimation of how much you have in terms of gains of IQ. And people who are, for example, black, raised in such white families, they will have an increase of IQ. So the parental environment and the wealth of white families certainly help. But it doesn't help much. We're talking about gains of IQ of a difference of 3 points of IQ approximately, if I remember correctly. So we're not closing the gap with this. The parental environment and wealth environment is at best giving something like closing the gap of about 10% of the difference. It's not far enough to have a theory of environmental only effects on intelligence. Another way you can do is developing right now, and it's the GWAS studies. The GWAS studies are a first look at specifically each letter of DNA and how they contribute or how they could contribute to intelligence. And what you can do then is, okay, you have identified 1,000 pieces of DNA. These particular genes seem to be highly related to high intelligent people in a specific race. Now you can study across race. You can say, well, if I have this explanatory power within the white race, how much of these genes are shared or how much of these genes are absent of another group? And then you can start having knowledge and hypotheses about the genetic explanation that could underlie IQ differences. Philip Hell says, JF, but several IQ points could literally get the brother off. I'm not reading this. I'm going to delete your chat here. Thanks for your contribution. Let's keep watching. We are at the subject of heritability. Let's keep listening.
And to illustrate this, we will paraphrase a thought experiment by geneticist Richard Lewontin. Let's say we take a packet of seeds and...
Well, Dr. Fausto says polygenic risk scores are looking more promising, JF, but that's what I'm referring to when I say GWAS. This is just the mathematical analysis technique applied later.
Plant them in fertilized soil in a controlled laboratory environment, and we ensure that the growing plants have sufficient and equal amounts of water and light. And doesn't that sound nice? Now, height in plants is a heritable trait, just like in humans, and the plants would thus grow to a range of different heights. Height in this experiment would be very highly heritable, because the fact we're ensuring the plants have an equal environment means that the variance in heights in the group is solely down to genetics. Next, let's say we do that experiment again, only this time we plant the seeds in bad soil and give them less, but equal within the group, amounts of water and light. The thing to understand here is that height in this second experiment would be exactly as heritable as in the previous experiment. All of the plants from the second group have the same group environment, meaning that again, the group variance in heights would be solely down to genetics. The poor environment will produce smaller plants, but since they are all subject to that environment equally, heritability remains high. The problem...
So here is presenting a situation in which we would be manipulating and creating conditions in which the genetic effect would appear or not appear. Those concerns are not important for the simple reason that you can care politically about the heritability of intelligence without knowing that it's genes. There's nothing in the bell curve that truly relies on it being DNA. I would argue that all of the argument of the bell curve can be rewritten or can be argued for on the basis of heritability, even without the physical basis that DNA is. The bell curve is not about knowing scientifically the biological mechanism and understanding the fine details of brain structure and how they are built by different genes. The bell curve is rather about a political statement faced with the phenomena of observed irritability. And since this irritability is observed in our society, I would say we don't really care if it's the soil or the gene of the plants or the light. No matter what it is, it's there, and therefore it's deserving of political attention. This is at least the message of the bell curve. We're back to a discussion on direct and indirect genetic effects.
Making a point about genetics is number 6. Cognitive ability is substantially heritable. However, as we've
you see that in the bell curve, they didn't say it has to be the genes for us to be right. They say substantially heritable. And that makes sense. There's really nothing that... They could have written the bell curve without even knowing that DNA exists. And they could have done the same observations.
Seen, a trait being heritable does not necessarily mean a direct genetic cause.
But again, this category is absolutely useless. Direct genetic cause or indirect. They are subject to the same rules of evolution. They are part of the phenotype. It doesn't matter how distant you are from the genes. Ultimately, all of your actions in the world, chemical and non-chemical, they all are the result of the presence of your DNA in the world. And if your DNA wasn't there, they wouldn't be there, and your phenotype wouldn't be there.
It does not tell us anything about the heritability of a particular individual's intelligence, and it cannot tell us the reason for differences between groups of people.
Well, that is false. The first statement, it is true, but it can tell us on average. So The truth here is just add the word average to your sentence. The second part is false. It's a statement that is only true if you limit yourself to twin studies. But with the other tools that we have to understand group differences, and also with the fact that it would be extremely surprising if, okay, so in the human species, we have a bunch of people, white people, and genes are heavily influencing their intelligence. But out there in Africa, you go there and suddenly these humans wouldn't be subject to similar genetic influence on their intelligence. It's like you have to invoke a very special sort of random for this to be the case. It's like, okay, so the human brain is so fundamentally different that a white person will be more or less intelligence based on their genes, but that you go all across the world on the other side of the planet and there's a continent of people here, black people, and these people, they don't have the same influence. The same genes don't affect their intelligence, and their intelligence is absolutely due to nutrients and environmental concerns. It's close to impossible, really. That being said, we have tools that are even more serious than this, and I've listed two of those: transracial adoption studies and GWAS, and they seem to be confirming our beliefs on genetic effects on intelligence being maintained across groups. Let's see here what I consider to be an establishment of a false standard of proof.
And Murray do not prove a genetic cause for cognitive ability, you might ask. Their later comparisons of IQ and environmental factors assume that IQ is largely genetic in origin, so presumably they do prove it at some point, right? Well, to put it bluntly, no. In their section...
So here he's asking for the bell curve to be proving that their effects are genetic in the sense of DNA based. They don't have to. Because although essentially the position of the bell curve is to say, look, if you ask me for a guess, it's probably DNA. It's probably DNA that accounts for 40 to 80% of the variation of intelligence in our society. But really, the rest of their argument, other than this call that they're trying to make, that's why they use the word apparently. You saw earlier, they use the word apparently. They're like, as best as we can tell you based on evidence back in 1995, it's probably DNA. But we don't care that much because ultimately it's irritability that matters. If there are chains of being that keep themselves into existence on the planet with high IQ and some other with low IQ, the consequences are the same whether the mechanism of transmission of this is DNA or other factors. The irritability is still there. Let's see here what Shaun says about correlation between adoptive parents and children.
Cognitive ability via intelligence test scores, we have to make the assumption that intelligence tests are an accurate measure of cognitive ability, but more on that in a moment. Even if we assume that the tests do give an accurate representation of cognitive ability, attempts to use these correlations to construct a simple genetic model for IQ run into several issues. Firstly, the IQs of identical twins do not perfectly correlate, as we would expect them to, given their nearly identical genetics.
Well, no. This is false. Since the acknowledgement of the bell curve is that it's only 40 to 80% of the variation explained by genetics, we wouldn't expect similar twins to be similar on intelligence. We would expect them to be only 40 to 80% similar and to have some degree of variability between them. So it is holding here the bell curve to a 100% standard when in fact the bell curve says itself, no, it's 40 to 80%.
The correlation of siblings who are raised apart is weaker than the correlation of siblings who are raised together, and probably most troublesome for a purely genetic model here is...
Well, he's arguing for a purely genetic model, but it's not what the bell curve says.
That there is also some correlation between parents and adopted children. Their scores correlate to some degree, despite there being no immediate genetic link beyond being the same species, of course.
That one is is fallacious. The assumption, so he's talking about the case of you take adopted children, their IQ is closer to their adoptive parent than would be predicted by random. In other words, adoptive parents are communicating parts of their intelligence to their children. It is fallacious to believe that this is not potentially a genetic effect. And here's how it works. In the human population, adoption is not the regular mode of reproduction. Most people will benefit from the parental care of their own biological parent. For this reason, a gene that is present in a parent, making him a good parent, and making him such a good parent that he can raise the IQ of his child, would be a parental genetic effect on the intelligence of the child. And since the adoption situation is rare enough that we can say it's not the major mode of reproduction in human society, then it could be that once we put adopted children with adoptive parents, you still have a genetic effect. It's the genes of the father that are helping the genes of the child get more intelligent. In the normal situation, the child would eventually have carried the genes of his parent, would have become a good parent in turn, and would have helped his own children, the grandchildren, to be more intelligent. In other words, it's not because it's detected in an adoption study that it's not the genes. He then goes on the subject of socially constructed races.
The reason I say designated racial groups instead of racial groups during this video is because on a genetic level, our skin color folk understanding of racial groups can be unhelpful. There can be greater genetic differences within our socially constructed racial...
So here, two unrelated points. He starts with the folk conception of race doesn't reflect the genetic reality. Well, the answer, we have it from Rosenberg, several articles throughout the 90s and 2000. The answer is it's correct at 99%. Self-identification of race, the default conception of race, is placing you exactly where a computer that knows your genes would place you. Some studies will reach levels of 90% because they mix in Indians and people are unsure, but really we're talking about identification rates, sometimes at 99% level, but always above 90%. So people have a very good feeling of their genes and of where they come from. They can identify it in themselves, they can identify it in others. Now, he moves from this point and he seems to be trying to justify it with the idea of variability. The idea of variability within races, in the genetics of races, the Lewontin fallacy, of course, has nothing to do with the folk conception of race and whether it is valid. The folk conception of race is valid because people say, I'm black, and we look at their genes and yeah, they got ancestors from Africa. Period. Now, the question of the diversity within race, as was fallaciously pursued by Lewontin, that is a completely separate question. It's the question of how big races are, really. The same way, so how do we undermine the Lewontin fallacy? I've been doing it many times. Let's redo it, and I'm sorry for people who are rehearing these explanations, but it's worth doing it in full. So The Lewontin fallacy is to say, well, races don't exist because there's more variability within the races than there is between the races. It's a statement that a category at a higher level does not exist because of variations at the smaller level. So why is that false? There is the example of cars and trucks. Consider the diversity of cars on this planet. The Lamborghini, the Toyota Tercel, the Accent Hyundai. There is a variability within the car category that goes beyond all of the sum of the differences between these cars and trucks. In other words, what differentiates a car from a truck is always the same thing. It's the presence of a place in the back to put large objects. It's the size of the tires, and it's the shape of the cabin, and generally the strength of the motor and transmission and size of wheels and all of the material being bigger. The differences between each car is extremely varied, and ultimately, if you make the differences between every car and how all of the detailed ways in which they can differ, you're going to have much more variation than the difference between cars in general and trucks in general. Yet, the car and truck category can be valid. It's not because of intra-diversity that extra-diversity, macro-diversity, becomes unimportant or undeserving of a label. What is it that deserves a label? Well, it's what is identifiably different, and races are identifiably different. Furthermore, that is further thinking on the Lewontin fallacy, Human Genetic Diversity, Lewontin's Fallacy, a book that explores this question. Edwards argued that while Lewontin's statements on variability are correct when examining the frequency of different alleles, variants of a particular gene at an individual locus, the location of a particular gene between individuals, it is nonetheless possible to classify individuals into different racial groups with an accuracy that approaches 100% when one takes into account the frequency of the alleles at several loci at the same time. In other words, Lewontin had to study 17 or 20 specific locus, so 20 specific places of DNA, and whether they had a certain genetic variant or not. Had he looked at 100 or 1000, he would definitely have concluded that, okay, even if a specific individual can have this gene or this gene, even if there's lots of variability on a single loci, if you take the statistical average of their likelihood of having certain loci and not over many loci, you will find that people are extremely well placed in their ancestry. In other words, Lewontin did not have enough knowledge with the number of genes he was studying. Let's still keep watching Shaun, but that undermines much of what he's about to say.
Groups than between them. I doubt anyone would be so naive as to expect us to one day identify the singular gene that controls both skin color and intelligence.
Well, that is ridiculous. It's not what we think. We already know that just skin color on itself, just race, is detectable at the many genes level. Zedda says, okay, JF is covering some important topics. Some in our sphere are here only for this reason. Do consider giving JF some love for his effort. And GJJD says, I need to get on this stream and start arguing with JF. No, I'm on the wings of Angel right now. I'm going to make a many-hour stream just autistically delivering all of my responses to Shaun. That is how we do here. It's a solo show, no way to intervene. That being said, if you think I'm saying something wrong, you can say it in the regular chat or send a super chat. Alright, where are we at? Let's keep listening to this part.
Someone having dark skin and thus being identified and identifying as black could have a whole range of genetic history. You can't...
Doesn't matter. The fact is we can predict statistically certain things about his genome, and 23andMe wouldn't work if it wasn't the case. 23andMe, you would be black in America, you send your 23andMe and it comes back and you're like, holy shit, I'm 100% Asians. We just don't get that. And the reason we don't get that is that races exist.
Read someone's genes by looking at their skin color. This is important.
Yeah, we literally can. We literally can tell you, alright, give me 100,000 pairs of DNA that vary within the human population. I'm going to tell you exactly how likely you are to be of each of those, and I'm not going to be wrong many times. I'm going to be, on average, correct.
For us, because the authors of the bell curve use our socially constructed racial groups in their book.
Well, the thing is, he failed at undermining socially constructed racial groups. So, on top of it, it's not a main subject of the bell curve, but even there, you failed at undermining these categorization. Rosenberg, very clear about this. 23andMe, the way people look, it allows you to detect ultimately their ancestry and their genes. Alright. Lewontin fallacy again, let's hear him.
Titled Race, Genetics and Pseudoscience, an Explainer, which discusses, among other things, how our traditional racial categorizations are not reflected in actual patterns of genetic variation, how distinct groups within Africa can be as distinct from each other as they are with non-Africans, how race is not a useful or accurate term for geneticists, and it says that it is often suggested that geneticists who emphasize the biological invalidity of race are under the thumb of political correctness, forced to suppress their real opinions in order to maintain their positions in the academy. Such accusations are unfounded and betray a lack of understanding of what motivates science.
Alright, you can talk all you want. If you don't have a way to address the facts I've laid out, if you don't have a way to explain, if it's not the relationship between racial self-identity and genes, why is it that 23andMe is succeeding? Why is it that Rosenberg is succeeding? Why is it that if you know only 100 pairs of DNA, you can say with close to 100% accuracy which race someone is part of?
Charles Murray responded to this post on Twitter a few days later, saying, "I can't understand why people are so eager to go public with positions for which the weight of the accumulating evidence is so unwelcome and that will be definitively settled within a few years." So it seems the evidence for Murray is still just a few years away.
Well, we're pretty much at the point where you cannot honestly engage in a denial of race. Shaun, why don't you make a video about 23andMe and how when 23andMe say that you are likely to be 100% African, how is that a lie? Because there's much money to be made for you. You just discovered that races don't exist, that genes that come from Italy don't exist, that genes that come from Africa cannot be identified. You can make hundreds of millions of dollars just suing 23andMe. How is 23andMe working if it's not a concept that is similar to race? Now, I know what he's going to say. He's going to say, it's not race, it's Klein's. Okay. Let's use Klein's. Let's do Klein science. And let's make forms where people indicate their Kleins. And let's have Kleinic racial preference in dating. Let's have Kleinic preferences in dating. And people are going to hang out a lot with their Kleins. Changing the word will not change the concept. So why don't you just admit it? Races exist. That's why 23andMe is making money. That's why Rosenberg was working. Next subject, because this one was totally beside the track. He introduces the moral problem of making political suggestions.
There yet, but here's a rough guess. It is not so fine to say, the evidence isn't there yet. Here's a rough guess. And based upon this rough guess, you should immediately suspend welfare programs for underprivileged children. But we'll talk more about this later when we discuss the...
So he just gives a subtle punch here. The third part of the video will be where we address that kind of point. But he's essentially saying, look, since I could blur reality enough, why would you do political decisions based on something that is so uncertain? The thing is, up to now, we've not heard a single valid argument against the arguments laid out in the bell curve. He had to strawman them. He had to say we don't know the gene, when in fact it's not what the bell curve claims. And so we're totally beside a working argument. Now he's going to introduce a new concept, which is native intelligence. I don't know that any scientist is using native intelligence. I mean, I can control F it in the bell curve. Native American. They do talk about Native American, but native intelligence is not a term used in the bell curve, and somehow Shaun comes with it.
The politics of the bell curve. For now, though, let's address the assumption I mentioned earlier when talking about twin studies. We have been, in this section, assuming that we can measure native intelligence accurately. If we cannot measure native intelligence accurately, then much of what we've talked about thus far is irrelevant. So it's now time to talk about IQ tests.
So he's increasing the burden of proof. So if you cannot measure native intelligence, which has not been used at all in the entire book, if you cannot get to this measure, you cannot say anything, and everything we've been talking about serves no purpose. Well, wait a minute. He's trying to introduce subtly a form of intelligence that would be absolutely genetic in origin. But again, we're back to the straw man. We're back to what the bell curve doesn't state, that it has to be the genes, and that none of our thoughts in this book are valid if it's not from the genes. No. Much of the arguments are social ones, and they would work with heritable intelligence that comes in other forms than the genes. Aiko says, Jeff, I'm going to watch your 100-hour stream tomorrow. I'm looking forward to it. Good luck and good night. Thank you. Alright, people are saying entropy is not working, JF. Sometimes they do a restart of the server. So here, let me restart it. I'm sorry for this. Work with heritage. Alright, is Shaun or JF correct? That was the survey question. So now entropy is restored. Sorry about this. We have a super chat. The Rosy Codex says, do you have a stance on GMO food? I don't have a strong stance. I don't mind about it. I'm scared for two things. One, GMO food is the first step toward GMO humans. And I'm scared about GMO humans. That being said, if it's not of this slippery slope, and if we can retain ourselves, I don't mind that we modify the vegetables and animals. I really don't mind. Now, another concern I have is sometimes the GMOs are being used in combinations with other things, like Roundup is one example. You have your tomato plant or something, you introduce a gene of resistance to a super strong insecticide or herbicide, and then you spray that herbicide into the whole field, everything dies except your tomato. that can lead to environmental damage. That I would be partly worried about, not necessarily systematically worried about though. There may be ways to do it safely. It's all a case-by-case matter, but the principle of modifying plants and animals, I'm not against.
So, I summarized the bell curve's claims about IQ tests as IQ.
Okay, so here are some of the claims. We won't review them because they're the claims of the bell curve. But we see here the case that is being built, some sort of native intelligence. And if you cannot find native intelligence, then you can't say anything. That is false. If you cannot find the gene underlying intelligence, you can't say anything. That is false. You can say a lot of things about the desirable state of the world and the desirable policies that would lead to a sustainable world by just knowing that it's heritable, just knowing that it will repeat across generation. I would say he has a burden of proof that he hasn't met Shaun, which is he has this assumption that the world can be made better, that with proper social engineering, we can fix things. That would need demonstration, but of course he doesn't engage on this. Let us get into what I would consider as the start of section 2 now. So now Shaun gets into the technical arguments. Now he's done bamboozling his crowd, misleading them with strawman and things that are irrelevant to the actual matters in the bell curve. And he gets into the technical details, starting with the Flynn effect.
Isn't that a huge contradiction? Aren't they basically admitting that IQ tests measure something other than inborn intelligence? After all, if IQ tests supposedly measure native cognitive ability accurately, how could scores be going up while cognitive ability is going down?
So here he's talking about the Flynn effect, and of course using his strawman of native intelligence. And he says the Flynn effect is in contradiction with the bell curve's thesis. What is the Flynn effect? It's the fact that over many years, over decades, we see a rise of IQ. We've been seeing a rise of IQ for many decades, and that is the Flynn effect. Now, is it in contradiction with the hypothesis of the bell curve? Well, no, it is not. There can be a Flynn effect observed, and yet there can be dysgenic forces in our world. And by dysgenic here in that context, all it means is forces of the world that will tend toward making us evolve toward less intelligence. How is that possible? Well, the dysgenic effect, the evolutionary pressure toward lower intelligence may operate at different time scale. It may be slower. Whereas what underlies the Flynn effect, most people believe that at least, and I think it's reasonable. Most people believe that the Flynn effect is of largely environmental origin. It's the fact that our life has improved substantially for every decades for the last 100 years. Everything is easier. We have better education, better nutrition. Everything is better and easier. And so the Flynn effect and the fact that there's a dysgenic pressure is not in contradiction. It's just that the dysgenic pressure, you will not see it operate its effect. You will not see yet the diminishment of IQ on a curve. That is just one possibility. Of course, bad news for Shaun, we do see the drop of IQ on a curve. So the dysgenic effect on intelligence that is predicted by Ernstein and Murray is very much happening. And in fact, it's been happening even before the publication of the book. So a look here at the Flynn effect and its reversal are both environmentally caused. Bernd, Bratsberg. So environmentally caused, that is their hypothesis. Let's let's leave it on the side and say that these guys don't have a way to be sure that it's environmentally caused. But no matter what, if you just want to know if the Flynn effect has reversed, you look at these numbers, it would have reversed in the 70s here. So the increase of intelligence is largely over and diminishing. So those are countries, I believe they are Norwegian here in this particular study. The IQ of rising generations is lowering. We have this on Wikipedia. If you look at it, the IQ has reached its peak around 95, and it's been dropping since then. If you look at the global average, of course, those are different graphs and they don't plot after 1990. I think that this is limited to 2013 on some graphs, but much lower on other graphs. If you look at the global one, you can see it reach a ceiling, and it's not even at the year 2000 yet. You can see it in Oceania also reaching a ceiling, and it's not even arrived at 2000. Oops, you guys are maybe not seeing Oceania. Here it is. So the Flynn effect is over. The Flynn effect is largely over. It doesn't mean that there won't be single years of increase, and that depending on the group you look at, there may be improvements of conditions of life in Africa or in any nation in the process of developing. But the prediction of Murray and the observations that they were doing and what has been happening since the publication of the book are absolutely in line with an end of the Flynn effect. In other words, all of the environmental amelioration that we could do, we've done them. And now it's all downhill from now, because if anything, while we were improving our lives, we may have been also having the dysgenic pressure already present. The dysgenic pressure being that the current world does not favor much effort, much need for intelligence. Really, you can survive today in ways that you couldn't survive 100 years ago. The grocery store is there, social welfare is there, and the world being more easy, people with less intelligence can easily survive. Now, Shaun is making the case in this whole bet that there is no evidence at all that there is a dysgenic pressure. Well, there is. You can see the book by Edward Dutton, At Our Wits' End. He goes through a lot in this chapter, but just look at the tendency of people to make babies. I'm gonna have to move to the table of content here because it went to the wrong page. Let me find it again. Fertility, literacy, the reversal of the Flynn effect. Why do smarter people have fewer children? What is the association between intelligence and fertility now? That is the right chapter. So, actual and planned. The difference, so when you get a negative number in that table, it means that there's a negative association between every IQ point that you gain and the number of children that you will get. So it's like a measure of the cost of being intelligent. And the cost is pretty high. Let's forget about planned, because what really matters is actual. Minus 0.27, minus 0.24, minus 0.25, minus 0.23. That's the progression from 1945 to 1964. So there is definitely a dysgenic pressure on intelligence, and it seems to be strongly maintained across the years. And it has been present till at least World War II. That's the kind of thing you need to determine if there is a dysgenic effect. You need to count the number of babies and associate with intelligence. Shaun doesn't do that. He just says there's not enough evidence. Now, he talks about the Flynn effect again here.
Trend in genetic cognitive ability. Well, unfortunately for Herrnstein and Murray, their main source of data, the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, is not much use here. Ideally, what we want to do is give IQ tests to the children of women who took part in the AFQT, so we could directly compare child to parent and see if any downwards shift was happening. However, this would be a mistake, as since our data is coming from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, the respondents are, appropriately, young. People who wait long.
So here he engages on a train of thought around, well, to really know if a Flynn effect is going on, we would have to test people and their mothers, and have had their mothers 20 years ago, and then we would test the child. We don't need to do that. The thing is, if you do that, you are not measuring the changes of populations. That's why any study of this must consider the demographics of this. People don't, the average level of intelligence in a nation doesn't change because the specific children of the mother is less intelligent. The baby is still carrying the genes of the mother. The reason intelligence changes is that the demographics of the population changes. It's that certain mothers are having more babies, certain mothers are having less babies. The only way you could measure this is by having a sampling of the entire population. On top of it, there is the immigration forces. You wouldn't get the effect of immigration in your Flynn effect measure if you were to only take mothers that were already present in your nation. Edward Dutton and Richard Lynn have been discussing these things, and there is a negative Flynn effect. Here they identify it in France. There was a drop, IQ decline per decade, they say, in the US children, 3. And I think they found something like 4 in verbal comprehension and 3.8 in full-scale IQ. So this is the range of diminishment that we have, and this strongly suggests that there is a dysgenic pressure, if you will, on IQ. And yet, you will have Shaun say this.
To have children with higher IQs. Limiting ourselves to looking at only young mothers will skew discussed in Intelligence, Genes and Success. Scientists Respond to the Bell Curve, a 1997 book which responds to many of the points made in the bell curve. The authors of that book, for their part, find no direct empirical evidence either.
See how it's phrased? The authors of this particular book found no evidence. Okay, so you got a guy somewhere who can't find. Well, you have a series of articles that I showed you from Edward Dutton. You have At Our Wits' End, which lists in a complete chapter pretty much all of the reversals of the negative of the Flynn effect that we found in European nations. It's pretty clear that it's going on. So, but this guy, this particular author, finds no evidence. Did he look for it?
For or against a dysgenic effect acting upon.
Okay, he's neither for or against. But what about the studies that were done in Finland, in Norway, in France, in the US? All quoted by Edward Dutton. Let us continue on the question of environments. But before that, Elia says, okay, thanks for your super chat. Tactical Boomerism says, why do YouTube DNA deniers always sound pretentious with fake European accents? Alright, let's keep watching.
construct such a thing would still deliver biased results if it were being carried out in a biased system. When Herrnstein and Murray say properly administered IQ tests are not demonstrably biased, they seemingly mean that the tests themselves do not contain words like regatta, not that the tests necessarily deliver fair results. So that is another potential problem with IQ tests to watch out for. Even if we eliminate as much cultural bias as possible from the test, we could still, thanks to the wider environment the tests are taking place in, be receiving biased results. For instance,
so you can see here the underlying method of Shaun. It's like he's always going to look for a bias. There must be some bias. If it's not in the test itself, it must be in the society that has administered the test. There is no end to this. It's essentially assuming that outside of the experiment there is some demon. And it's a very Marxist way of approaching the problem. What I would say to Shaun on this is, if you believe there are measurable bias on the tests that we have left, after we've changed all the tests, after we went for the Raven matrices because they were less culturally sensitive, after we've run these tests across the world by various experimenters that couldn't possibly have coordinated their action. After all of these confirmation, the burden of proof lies on you if you say, no, there's still something going on. There's still some intimidation going on in the way they speak to the people depending on their cultural origins. At this point, you are being paranoid, essentially, and we have to answer to this the same that we would answer to someone saying, oh, it's all God doing all this. Oh no, the ball fell, but there's no gravity. It was all God. Okay, you have alternative explanations, but you have no proof for them. You don't meet the standard of proof that these researchers have gone through the trouble of going through. So at this point, Shaun is just thinking out loud. He then criticizes the idea of the comparison of IQ tests between African Americans and Africans proper.
Administered, right? After all, Herrnstein and Murray themselves discuss many of the same issues that we just have. It would follow that given their familiarity with these potential problems, they would of course endeavour to avoid them. So let's see how they do on that front. We'll take a look at a particular section of the bell curve now, see what the claims are, and then have a bit of a dig into the sources backing up those claims. And this is from a section titled, How do African Americans compare with blacks in Africa on cognitive tests? And I quote, This question often arises in the context of black-white comparisons in America, the thought being that the African black population has not been subjected to the historical legacy of American black slavery and discrimination, and might therefore have higher scores. Richard Lynn was able to assemble 11 studies in his 1991 review of the literature. He estimated the median black African IQ to be 75, approximately 1.7 standard deviations below the US overall population average, about 10 points lower than the current figure for American blacks.
So this is something we've already talked about. Indeed, the African Americans, they are the population of blacks that is most interbred with whites, and they are also the better position than their African peers in the IQ scale.
In summary, African blacks are, on average, substantially below African Americans in intelligence test scores. Psychometrically, there is little reason to think that these results mean anything different about cognitive functioning than they mean in non-African populations. For our purposes, the main point is that the hypothesis about the special circumstances of American blacks depressing their test scores is not substantiated by the African data. So this is Herrnstein and Murray's answer to those who point to the legacy of slavery and discrimination in the United States as an explanation for the differences in IQ scores between it.
And it's a good argument. So you thought it was slavery? Well, here's another country in which white men have not been oppressing. And you can take all of Africa, you can take the map I was showing here. Let's see if I still have it. The global IQ map. There it is. So it's like, okay, what do you want to invoke in terms of systematic oppression? Oh, okay. So white people are very evil in America and they would be oppressing certain minorities. Okay, what about this island? What about this island? What about this country? What about this country? This country? And it's like, you have to look at this map and realize that the white man has not been oppressing all of this continent. Or if they have been, it has not been in the same proportion. And Ethiopia, of course, comes as an example.
Its black and white populations. They point to black people in Africa and say, hey, well, they also got lower scores. Black African people haven't been subject to discrimination in America, after all, so doesn't this prove that discrimination in America can't be depressing black IQ scores? Well, not really. Herrnstein and Murray's decision to limit their concern here to American black slavery and discrimination is a huge oversight, because there could also be discrimination in whichever parts of Africa they are talking about, if you follow. That could be, in a similar way, depressing the scores there too.
Well, the thing is, you're certainly not going to have a white oppression or discrimination in countries that were never colonized. Now, you could argue that, okay, what is it that we have left? That the blacks are discriminating against themselves? The thing is, at some point you reach the point where, okay, but that is, if it is the natural state of the population, if you leave an entire country of people and they converge toward a certain IQ, the discriminatory explanation cannot be invoked. You can invoke that that population tends toward violence, and this leads to countries in which young people don't have time to learn, and so they don't reach good IQs in exchange. But at some point, you're going to have to recognize that it is the natural state of this population. Ultimately, it's not a question so much of, is that due to a direct effect of the genes on intelligence, or do these people tend to create societies that are more violent or less educational? It's all of this together. The statement of the bell curve is a general one about what people converge toward when left on their own. That's what matters, because if a population is unable to reach certain levels of intelligence when left on their own, that means that you are invoking the eternal doctor, the idea of, combating the death of a patient constantly, investing more and more energy. Oh, his heart is giving up. We need to plug some electric pads here. Oh no, he's not having nutrients enough. Okay, we need to plug his blood. Oh no, his brain is falling in coma. All right, we need a reanimation device or something. The thing is, if a population is unable to reach these IQs in its natural state without intervention, then you have people who will be dependent. And any sort of interventions of the state that you put in is going to cost an increase in cost as they make more and more babies. If you say, all right, these people could reach 90 IQ, but they would need $100,000 of investment per head in terms of state social welfare services, teachers, etc. What happens when the next generation comes in? You still need to help them. They still haven't figured out a way to live and be sustainable at high IQ level. Luckily, certain nations have found a way to do it without much help from the state.
If that were the case, attempting to use the African data as some sort of control test for the American data would be fairly ridiculous, to say the least. America does not have a monopoly on discrimination and oppression, does it?
Well, certainly this argument is invalid in light of Ethiopia, unless you want to consider the only invasion of Ethiopia, which was very temporary in history, made by Italy, I believe, but they never stayed there and they never colonized. So what is it that led to this IQ in Ethiopia? It's not the white man. The invasion of Ethiopia by Italy was shorter than what Quebec has gone through. I've been more oppressed than your average Ethiopian. I'm not kidding. I mean, my ancestors have been taken over by the English, my Quebecois ancestors. And so at some point you're going to realize that there are countries in Africa that have been subjected to less extensive colonial history than even some white country. So what do you deal with this? Why is it that oppression never works when it's for white nations? Why is it that you don't conclude that Quebecois should be the geniuses at 140 IQ levels because they've been taken over by the English, by Canada? Of course, we know why it is. It's because Marxists always go for the victim, for the person that they perceive as needing help. Elia Logo Bizarre says, alright, I will not read this one. In fact, I will delete it. Ryan Knows says, JF, I hate to hand over my DNA to Google if I don't have to, so I went with Ancestry DNA. As an expert, how do these products compare? Do you advise 23andMe specifically? Thanks. Personally, I've been trying 23andMe and I've been satisfied. But I don't know Ancestry DNA, so I'm unable to compare, but I was satisfied with 23andMe. Hello, Mama JF, what's up?
Okay, but what you say when...
Well, wait, is that YouTube compatible, what you want to say?
No, it's my voice.
It's
my
your
voice
voice.
is bad.
Oh yeah, you have a cough.
No, but what you say, because I think the leftists say that because, we oppress them because they work in the mines, and then they couldn't go to school and that.
Yeah, but we didn't do that to Ethiopians.
You sure?
Pretty sure.
Because all the gold mines and all the minerals, they need to go dig in the earth, and then I think they find the cheap workers there, and even children.
Okay, so they are oppressed because they are working for corporations.
Yes.
Okay, well, I work for corporations too, and it didn't affect my IQ. Rosa Rogg says, can't catch the show live, but if you have time, would you check out this video? No, I don't have time tonight. vKXgmnuFMgU says, feels like back in the crowd days. I love it. Alright, let's keep watching. Where are we at? He then contests the IQ test in Nigeria specifically for having 86 subjects only.
And the test was given as though it was to be a new experience with full instructions repeated and evidently equally necessary in most cases as previously. Men were not overtly asked to pit their present against their previous efforts. Results were presented in Table 1. The relation between retested matrices and EFT is significantly greater than between the initial matrices testing and EFT, even though in the former comparisons the tests were done 6 months apart. Table 1 shows that the overall differences in retesting were significant and suggests that improvements were found particularly among the lower initial scorers.
So the idea that retesting helps your score on IQ is not new, and it's not particularly interesting. You can measure that. You can measure that after 1 week, after 1 month, after 2 months, and you can get gains in the most extreme cases, I think up to 10 points, approximately 10 points. Because if you've already done the test, of course you are more prepared. You know more what it's about. That being said, it's not a problem for science. We can compare nations on a first test basis, and then we can compare them on a second test basis. And the scales of variations are within 10 IQ points. So it's not like it's going to explain an average difference of 30, 40 IQ points. Elia says, Chinese oppression under Mao was very great. In fact, greater than what other oppressions have been. Yeah, I mean, that's the problem. This is a special pleading. This is the fallacy. Special pleading where you are using oppression and discrimination but pretty much everyone has been the subject of heavy criminal history, heavy oppression, heavy authoritarianism. It happened to every nation on this earth. War, suffering. Why is it that it's only being used in certain cases?
Taken with the improved EFT correlation in Table 2, a strong case can be made that the second testing gave a distinctly more valid measure of whatever abilities the matrices and EFT involve. So to quickly summarise,
Well, again, special pleading. It's why would we use the second test for Nigeria and the first test for America? We need to compare things that are similar to each other. So, of course, scientists care about using the same test for comparison. If a scientist starts advantaging some countries and saying, oh, you know what, Nigeria has been scoring low, I'm going to take their second attempt. Well, you just fucked it up. Your scientific study is not valid anymore. So, not a good one, not a good argument here. Let's continue.
Testees know how items of the test.
Hello, Mama JF, what's up?
Oh, it's true. Sorry, because I changed my idea sometimes quickly.
You changed the ID?
Yes, because it's true, like, the Industrial Revolution?
Yes.
That was the why they were fucking working a lot
in
the mines.
Oh yeah, our ancestors were essentially being totally exploited, working 12 hours a day. There was no...
Have you seen the book Germinal? Have you read this?
No, I've not read it.
Oh my god, I don't know why I read this, but it's like this, is the whites, they go in the mine and they make it.
Yeah, it wasn't paradise for white people at any time.
They call la grève.
They make strikes.
They make strikes and then they cannot eat for so long.
Yes.
Germinal, you should read this.
Alright, Patrick Doirion says, IQ differences that white Europeans and white East Asians have compared to blacks is explained by preparing for winters. White skin is winter skin. It's possible that we evolved to have paler skin for the purpose of having more suns of rays of light hit our body, and some people are hypothesizing that it's for production of more vitamin D in winter. So that's the side of the skin color explanation. Could be. It could also be that we were confronted with more diverse weather, and therefore we had to be it could have been that we needed to increase the mutation rate of our DNA. That's more out there, but I like this potential explanation that we could have evolved white skin to expose our testicles and sexual organs to more genetic modifications so we could adapt faster. It's a long shot, but it's out there. It's been proposed. As far as intelligence, well, there is this winter theory of intelligence that essentially nations that were located with colder winters, those that were more distant from the equator, have progressively evolved to handle the difficulties of winter through intelligence, preparation, planning ahead. Possible, this one. Possible. I wouldn't deny it, but I'm not sure. ZP Taz says, how should white people react to East Asians having higher IQ? That's a good question. I mean, I don't care. Personally, I don't feel that we should put so much importance on IQ. This is why it's my point of disagreement with the bell curve, this focus on cognitive classes. I don't think it matters that much. I think that what makes a nation great is not so much IQ in and of itself. I think that you need a certain amount of creativity, innovation, and you need a certain amount of respect and understanding of each other's need and understanding boundaries and limits and laws, and not to be surrounded by creepy people who want to control your life. So I think those are much more important than just pure intelligence. I don't think we should be offended or seek to repair the fact that we have 5 points lower than the Chinese in IQ. I really like who we are, and we should respect ourselves even at lower intelligence level. And if you don't want to take too much, if you want to really care about intelligence, then you should care about other aspects than just IQ, like creativity. Clearly, our civilization has been creating some of the greatest things in the world. The technologies that are revolutionary, scientific understanding that is absolutely fascinating. So there's nothing to be shy about in terms of our accomplishments. If a generation of Chinese people is rising and they tend to have 5 IQ points more than my nation, I don't take issue with it. It doesn't bother me. All right. He goes then into the idea of less stressful administrations of IQ tests and how they could maybe improve the score of certain populations.
Tests are to be responded to, and when the method reduces the anxiety of the subjects about being tested, then the results obtained from the administration of the test are remarkably different from those that result from administration in which the same test is presented in the same way to all testees regardless of their cultural origin. It goes on to detail how a researcher named Pons gave the Raven's standard progressive matrices test to a group of Zambian copper miners in 1962 using the standard method of delivery. Then later, Pons administered the test again to another group, only this time using a different method of test presentation. As Table 1 shows, the second group showed a rather dramatic difference in score. Now, the thinking behind all this might be that a group of Zambian copper miners aren't necessarily going to be all that familiar with taking academic tests, not to.
So that argument is defeated by himself. It's like he admitted, okay, you took a bunch of copper miner, and then you have a bunch of people who are likely more educated or who could be different in any way. And of course you get a different result. So at this point, Shaun is recognizing himself. This is not a serious case of difference, because the two treatments, there's this claim that it could be the fact that the administration of the test was less stressful and they were given more chances to learn about the test, or it could be that it was a completely different group. Well, those are poorly performed scientific experiments.
To generalize, and if you want more accurate results, it might be worth taking the time to actually explain to them what it is that they're being expected to do. Now, Crawford Nutt claims that the different method of presentation did not alter anything about the test itself and is based upon suggestions found in the 1960 Guide to the Standard Progressive Matrices written by John C. Raven, aka the guy what invented the Raven's Progressive Matrices test. After reporting the findings of Pons, Crawford Nutt takes things one step further and tests a selection of pupils from a long-established high school situated in the black residential area of Soweto near Johannesburg, a school that is described as having high standards and whose students would be used to being tested. Crawford...
This is so deceptive. He's introducing a case of the most elite school of the region, and he's going to say, look, these people outperform white people. Like average white people. The thing is, this is so basic. Yes, we knew that if you select the geniuses in a country, even if the country is low intelligence, if you select the geniuses, of course they're going to be better than an average citizen from even the most intelligent country. What the fuck is this argument?
Nutt tested 2 samples of these school children using the same presentation method as described by Pons, and the results received were actually slightly higher than the equivalent age range of the white group on whom the test was normalized. Now you might say, what has Crawford Nutt actually proved there? Test results go up the closer you get to a good school, I suppose. This shouldn't be surprising anyone. If you test a relatively uneducated group of copper miners, you get one result. Do that same test in a competitive academic institution and you will get a higher result. By changing the method of test presentation and changing the group which you are testing, you can get a whole range of results. This is why researchers don't usually test people in just one area, one workplace, or one...
So this whole line of argumentation, he has undermined it himself. He understands that there's no way to compare this. There's no way to say, oh, this was not expected, that we would have 30 geniuses in this particular school. Now he goes on to criticize. He says, that's why you don't do your stuff in a specific location. Well, people have been looking at it plenty. And the map that I showed you, for example, the map that I keep showing you of the entire world, you can see that they have sampled a lot of studies. This is IQ and the Wealth of Nation by Richard Lynn. This is largely the basis of the global IQ map that I showed you, this one. So, Nigeria, for example. Let's get to Nigeria and you will see the number of studies that it is based in.
Yeah.
What?
Can I add something about the mind? Okay, because I just remember, I think my grandfather was working in the mine. I think it was the amiens.
Oh yeah,
I think
asbestos.
He died of lung cancer because of this.
Yeah.
So even the whites too are working in the mines there.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There is maltreatment of employees in all races. Nigeria. I'm looking for the studies on which this is based. Alright, there we have it. So just the data on Nigeria in this entire book. You have 30 subjects from Howard and Roland in 54. IQ 67. You have 480 subjects from Ferron, 1965. You have 86 subjects from Weber, 69. 375 subjects from Farmeyer, 1975. 150 subjects from Okurotifa, 76. 88 subjects, 165 subjects, 120 subjects, 98 subjects, 402 subjects. And the variation is there. Of course, there are different ways in which these researchers will specifically administer the test, but nothing is bringing you to the conclusion that there may be such bias that these people are not somewhere around 75, maybe worst case scenario 80. If you want to be ultra generous, if you want to take those studies that were made in elite schools. But nothing is bringing this population to 100. Nothing is bringing this population to an IQ that is comparable to that of China. There is definitely something being measured in these masses of studies using different questionnaires, different interpreters, different forms, different questions. There's definitely something being measured here. And Shaun is complaining that this is done on, that this particular case in the bell curve was based on 32 subjects. Well, look at the more recent evidence. And if you're really on the search for truth, you won't be questioning a book of 1995 or 1994, I don't remember. You won't be questioning a more than 20-year-old book without looking. As new evidence emerged since then, are there better meta-studies that have been done? And the conclusion that you would have reached if you had done it is that even if you bias your selection of studies to be only in the elite African schools, picking the geniuses of the geniuses, they've done it. a systematic literature review of the average IQ of sub-Saharan Africans. Those researchers are researchers that contested the 70 or 75 measure. They ended up selecting the best, what they considered to be the best studies. What do they reach? The IQ of African countries must be around 82. It's like, okay, so if we kick out everything that even the researchers who are partisan, who want to demonstrate that the current counts are bad, we're still up to 82 only. We still have racial differences. Nothing, the only thing that has changed really is that instead of being red like this, you would be more dark yellow like this. There's literally not a single point of the bell curve that changes. Trevor Hink sends $25. Thank you so much. He says, I brought the surveys from NYLS from the BC to sociology class to explain race/crime/white privilege. While I was called many nasty names, the surveys or points I made were never refuted, and girls gave me googly eyes. Very interesting stories, but what is googly eyes? Does that mean that they were liking you or not liking you? Googly eyes are a small plastic craft supplies. Also, did that mean that they were offended by what you were saying? Generally, girls don't like you to get too deep philosophically. I would suspect that this was negative. Gary says, great stream, JF. Would be interesting to hear your thoughts on scientific advancements and the social/political conditions that led to them. Yeah, it's a very good question because it's a tough one. Because much of the advancement has been engineering, really, in terms of the productivity of our industries. And that's one thing. But on the other hand, we have a line of purely basic scientists and intellectuals like mathematicians and like what led to Descartes? What led to Descartes? What led to all of these prime number theorists in Western civilization? Those are important questions. I think it's a different mechanism than what leads to Henry Ford and people who start producing cars and planes and stuff like this. There could be commonalities, but I suspect that it's different mechanism to some extent. Alright, let's continue listening to what Shaun has to say.
School, and then try to pass off that singular result as representative of the entire country that they live in.
Yeah, so on this point that we don't have enough data, well, if you're not satisfied with what we had in 1994 or some year around that, then look at the more recent evidence. We have thousands of subjects from Nigeria. Now, if you're not happy with this still, there's the problem that many nations are inaccessible. It's quite simple. There's places where scientists can't enter, or they will do so at high risks. For example, North Korea, very hard to get genetic data there. There's the Native Americans. Some communities of Native American refuse to participate to genetic studies and stuff of the kind. You're gonna have to deal with this. It doesn't mean that what we have is worthless. If you're not happy with what we have, work to get more. But the current estimates that we have are based on accessible data, on what we could do.
That would be a remarkably ignorant thing to do. Speaking of, back to Richard Lynn and his claimed IQ of 75 for Zambia, which cites both Pons and Crawford Nutt as the source of the data there. So how did that happen? Well, what Lin does is, he cites the much lower results from the research carried out by Pons, which are presented in Crawford-Nutt's paper, and then completely ignores Crawford-Nutt's experiment in the school, which reported results above the white norm.
The thing is, if he was excluding elite schools when taking the IQ in America and Britain, of course he has to exclude the elite school in Africa. What Shaun is demanding here is that when we measure the IQ of nations, we take elite schools only if we're in Africa, and then we take anyone who can fill the form in America and Britain to recalibrate the result. That's literally self-deception for the purpose of eliminating your consciousness of a difference. It's like, you are demanding us to treat Zambia in a different manner. Now, if you're not happy with the fact that this elite school study was rejected, you can get into more current data. Because since the bell curve, there has been other studies, some of them performed, others were just found. Consider this one, Zambia. MacArthur 1964 was not quoted in the bell curve. You have it now in the 2009 Richard Lin book. And 750 new subjects and 292 subjects. And what is the conclusion? The conclusion is it's exactly the numbers that were used in the bell curve. It's like we're doing it on 300 new subjects, same result. We're doing it on 800 new subjects, same result.
The entire point of Crawford-Nutt's paper goes totally unmentioned by Lin, who simply extracts the data that he wants and discards the rest.
Well, if he has discarded for white nations and Asians, why would he not discard it for Zambia?
He had data showing a black African test score that was above the white norm, and he simply decided to ignore it.
It was slightly above the white average, and it was an elite school.
Also, like the previous paper we discussed, this study did not report IQ scores for the testees. Those are simply concocted by Lin out of the Raven's progressive matrices data using a sophisticated statistical technique called guessing. So to understand what Lin is...
So here is representing what Lin does as guessing. It is not guessing. What Lin is doing is normalizing according to a standard. So what he typically does is he will take the scores of British people, and then he will get on a similar test the scores of another nation, and he will adjust them so that we can measure intelligence in a stable fashion. Typically we'll use like British responses in 1979. And every score will be readjusted with the standard of British 79, or else you're faced with the fact that everyone is moving. Britain is moving. So Britain in 2019 is not at the same intelligence level as Britain in 1979. He calls it guessing. It's really not. It's estimating based on available evidence and using a common comparison basis when possible. Let us move to a point where he claims that there is statistical manipulations on the side of the bell curve.
Return a bell curve distribution. For example here, the armed forces qualifying test used in the bell curve did not return a bell curve distribution. It was, after all, designed to test readiness to join the armed forces, not IQ. As a result, it does not differentiate between people to a large enough degree, so Herrnstein and Murray, to make the results conform to a bell curve, recalculated the scores. Here is a graph of the raw AFQT scores overlaid with Herrnstein and Murray's recalculated bell curve scores from the book Inequality by Design. And as we...
So that is a procedure used in statistics called normalization. Not something that I like because it's just graphically moving the numbers. It's taking out of the people here and moving them here, and out of the people here and moving them here, until you over-represent, if you will, this part of the curve, so that you end up having a bell curve. It is not important, and most importantly, the bell curve authors have already indicated that they were doing this just to speak in a common language, the language of bell curves, and so that the book would have a certain stability across chapters. They have also provided the raw data in the appendix. I'm looking for it right now. I think it was in those pages. Let me find it. Well, let's continue. Actually, I think I can find it based on what Shaun will show in terms of images.
We can see too many people scored too highly on the test, and there isn't enough differentiation between people on the upper end of the scale in particular. So yes, that's right. In the book, The Bell Curve, the principal intelligence test the authors use as a source did not return a bell curve distribution. To transform these results into a bell curve, Herrnstein and Murray exaggerated the slight differences at the end of the scale. They basically gave extra credit for being near the tails of the bell curve and less for being in the middle. They did this as...
It should be noted that, to start with, your position on a test score is relative. It's relative to how the test is designed, to how it gives grade. So it's arbitrary to start with. Now I find the quote so I can... We therefore computed... There it is, the part where they explain their normalization. And they give you the raw data. So if you're annoyed by this normalization, they say, well, you can use the normalized one, or you can use the raw data. The fact is, black and white differences appear greater in the raw data, 1.36, whereas they appear only as 1.25 in the normalized data. For the 1989 data, they appear as 1.30 before the modification, whereas they appear as 1.21 after the modification. In other words, this modification of the data is a process that they've done to be able to speak in common language in terms of standard deviation, in terms of statistic, but the raw data is actually more in line with their hypothesis, so it really changes nothing. Shaun here is alarmed by something that has no consequence. Let us continue.
Using a different one could lead to a different Nigerian IQ being calculated. In his 1991 review of the literature cited in the bell curve, however, Lynn does not identify what standardization he's using for the various tests he is comparing. What this means is that there is a gap in Lynn's calculations that can only be filled by faith in his academic honesty, which...
So here he claims that the 1979, that the book of Lynn is based on a 1979 standardization, British, I think it's British, and that Flynn does not indicate how he did this standardization. And this is just to give you an idea of how Shaun does this video. He's throwing uncertainty at you. He's like, yeah, we're not sure. He didn't say it. Well, the thing is, he said it. You just have to go to the right part of the book. Here it is. He says, the adjustments made for these secular increases in IQ are 3 IQ points per decade calculated for the United States by Flynn, for all tests except the progressive matrices, for which there are 2 IQ points per decade for Britain, for the years 1938-1979, calculated by Lynn and Hampson, and for the years 1979 to 2008 for children up to the age blah 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 blah. He then uses the term 1979 British standardization. So this clearly relies on these 2 studies. So you can go check Lynn 2009 or Lynn and Empson 1986, and you're going to see exactly the populations on which they base their standard. It is right here. The rise of national intelligence, evidence from Britain, Japan, and the USA. And it's in this paper that they have used 1979 as a basis to compare a single country or to compare it across different countries. The entire method is available, but Shaun has decided that they don't say it in that sentence. Well, look just one paragraph before, and you're going to have the explanation. What else do we have? The test is biased, a claim by Shaun.
The results showed that this assumption was completely wrong. In fact, language played such an important role, and the knowledge of English of the majority of black testees was so poor that certain tests, for example the JAT-4 synonyms and the JAT-8 memory paragraph, proved to be virtually unusable. And let me just quote that again. Certain tests proved to be virtually unusable. Owen also...
Who is surprised? A test that involves verbal ability is less good across culture and unusable.
So writes elsewhere, the results of the current investigation clearly show that language played a prominent role in all the tests containing language items, which is a wonderful multiple stab wounds shown to shorten life expectancy bit of academic obviousness there. Language ability was not the only way in which the junior aptitude test was biased, however. In a section entitled Item Bias in the Tests of the JAT, Owen notes several ways.
The thing is, you have to show us in the bell curve where these studies would have been misinterpreted. It's okay that there are some tests that are unusable, but did that lead to a false conclusion by the bell curve? No, you're not showing us anything on the bell curve. You're just showing, oh look, they are referencing these papers, and these papers are admitting that their study is not very good. Well, okay, but if it's all we have, we can still have a look at it. And does this influence the other studies, the other tests that we've shown in 2009 in the list of Nigeria tests that I gave you? How is this verbal specific weakness of one test influencing all of the other things that we've seen on the map? It's not.
In which the tests were culturally and economically biased. For example, he here lists several test items on the first test in the JAT and states, a common element in most of these items was that they presupposed knowledge or a degree of knowledge on the part of the testee, and mentioned such things as electrical appliances, microscopes, and Western types of ladies' accessories, going on to write, thus, in the case of both the Indian and black testees, it seems that the single largest cause of bias lay in the fact that the pupils were not familiar with the objects represented by the pictures. Cultural and socio-economic status factors probably also played a role in this regard. So this test is biased.
Okay, there are bias tests out there. We vastly changed to non-culturally dependent tests. The Raven matrices are very popular for this because they are just placing cubes in some abstract questions. There's not even a language understanding needed. So, okay, these bias tests exist. They don't change what we record with the other tests.
Then, the study examining it says it is biased, but according to Richard Lynn, this is the single best study of the Negroid intelligence. This is the best one. The one that tests segregated school children in a non-native language and calls its own results virtually unusable. In Lynn's review...
Well, there's no contradiction between saying it's the best and it's not perfect. It may have been that in these years that we didn't have much coming from single countries. But now we have more modern data. So why don't you, if you're truly interested in searching for the truth, you should just be looking at the Lynn 2009 book.
Norms is 69. It is also around the median of the studies listed in Table 3. It is proposed, therefore, to round this figure up to 70. Why? And take this as the approximate mean for pure Negroids. God damn. What Lynn has done here is ridiculous. He has taken 11 studies from a period between 1929 and 1991 with vastly different sample sizes reporting data from different tests, most of which didn't even report IQ scores, transform the data into what he reckons the equivalent IQ scores were using some unknown standardization, picked one that was sort of near the middle, and said that's the average Black African IQ.
It makes total sense. You're taking data from various tests, so if one test is erroneous in some way, at least the others will not be as biased, or they will be biased in the other way. But there's nothing saving your race denial position here, Shaun. Suppose that it was a bad idea to take many tests. Alright, let's eliminate some tests. Let's only keep those with progressive matrix. And suppose that it was not a good idea to take this one and this one. Suppose we just take the best test right here. At Nigeria 86. You just take the best of the best. You eliminate all of the others with all of your arguments. We're still not at racial equality in intelligence. So you're adding dabs and dabs, but there's no way the truth reaches your position. There's no way there's no way that all races on this planet have the same intelligence. Period. No matter how much you work. He does a couple of ad hominems. I'm going to give you an example of it, but it's not particularly interesting.
Lynn, he has more than 20 citations in their bibliography, and they thank him specifically in the acknowledgements. If this is the sort of data that Charles Murray is willing to accept as legitimate, how can we trust anything he says anywhere?
It's not illegitimate to normalize. It's not illegitimate to make averages. It's not illegitimate to take data from different tests and have a global view. As long as you don't conclude specifically about tests and you just want a umbrella view of humanity, and as long as it's the only data available, why wouldn't you do it? Why wouldn't you use what's available instead of complaining about the imperfection? Shaun is not here telling us, hey, I have some other test that is better. He's not presenting an alternative. He's not saying that he went himself in Africa to do the test. And so I will trust the scientist who went to do the test and who came back with something, rather than a guy on the internet saying, no, we should reject this. We know nothing.
Psychologist. It matched 204 black Zimbabwean pupils and 202 white English students from London inner city schools for age, 12 to 14 years old, sex and educational level, both samples being characterised as working class, and then goes on to say that the white students from London got higher test results than the black students from Zimbabwe. However, Murray takes a cue from Richard Lynn and leaves out all the context. The main thing here being that Zimbabwe was a British colony known as Rhodesia until it gained independence in 1980 following a 15-year civil war. Rhodesia was a discriminatory, racially segregated state. 12 to 14-year-olds in 1994 would have been born around the time of Zimbabwe's independence to parents who were raised and educated in a segregated British colony.
And this is an example of Shaun having his critiques are so isolated, they don't take into account the greater picture. It's like, okay, you believe that in this particular spot, you believe that there was an injustice done to people that could have impacted the IQ measure. Alright, but how do you explain the IQ measures of the countries around? Don't you see a pattern in this map? Don't you see that at the center of the planet there's a line of more red and yellow colors, and that at the extremity there is blue? And if you are annoyed by the potential that political history or domination by whites is what caused it, again, go to Ethiopia. Average IQ in Ethiopia, 69. there is not a white person in the world responsible for 69 in Ethiopia. How are you going to explain the wider pattern now that you've committed to specific appeal to biases that you haven't proved at all? I mean, we don't know what he's saying about the political history of Zimbabwe. Did that impact IQ? Did that impact it positively, negatively? We don't know. It may have, but he has no measure. And yet he asks you to believe on faith that there is a bias. Let us continue here. He goes into an ad hominem of that is very clear. 139:30.
Is that the allegation is not that these studies are written by racists, it's that the studies are being deliberately misinterpreted and misrepresented by racists. Racists like Richard Lynn, who strip from the studies all context and analysis and use them to push a racist worldview. Murray fails to see that the problem is not that it is impossible to find other studies that have similar results to the ones cited in the bell curve. It's that he's willing to treat data collected in a segregated white supremacist state as a legitimate source to inform us about inherent racial differences. That is the issue here. On a more general...
So he keeps doing these reference to white supremacy and racism, and what I will say is, look, if you have better data made by non-racists, I will start considering reading them and listening to it. But what we have is that right now, even anything that comes close to a scientist who contest the view that African IQ is properly measured, the best that they could do is reach 82 as an estimate. There's still a racial gap. And okay, maybe it's not 70, maybe it's 82. I don't care that much, to be honest. Ultimately, the point of the bell curve remains in full. At 82, there are still major racial differences. At 82, there are still concerns for American policy. There's nothing that will be saved by even the most partisan reinterpretation of the data. Now we are entering the third part of the video, and at this point Shaun will be launching a full-on ad hominem attack on everyone. Essentially, the takeaway message of the last part of the video is everyone involved in this research is a Nazi. They are the nephews of Nazis. They are the girlfriends who married some Nazis. Their grandfathers were Nazi. It is absolutely shocking how he switches from the technical aspect to, alright, I'm going full on ad hominem. He still talks about some things that are intellectual that perhaps we can review here. The claim that all they care about in the bell curve is income. He claims that bell curve has remained blind to complex realities of the social world.
Important with regards to the likelihood of a young person being in poverty. The first one. Yep, that's all. Herrnstein and Murray's consideration of environmental factors extends to parental education, income, and occupation. That's all. As far as they're concerned, with regards to determining predictors of poverty, all the other things on this list have no effect. Your family's wealth has no effect. Family composition, the area where you live, the quality of the school you went to, the crime rate, all irrelevant. What they have...
Well, it's not because you chose a variable to ground your comparison that you are saying the rest is irrelevant. To the contrary, the problem of multiple variables is that they are all contained into each other. So the rate of incarceration somehow tells you a little bit about your levels of intelligence. It tells you a little bit about the education of your family. The education of your family tells you a little bit about your nutrition. Your nutrition tells you a little bit... Everything tells you a little bit about everything else. So it's wise to have chosen income and say, look, we're just going to compare income and cognitive ability. Because we want to make a point that in this super complex system in which all variables are linked to each other, that cognitive ability seems to offer a good entry point, a good predictive power, compared to another entry point, which would be income. It's absolutely justifiable, and it's not a denial of the rest. It is a good way to weight one thing with respect to the other. Trevor Hing says, slightly off topic, I apologize, but was curious if the IQ of historical figures or celebrities could be measured with some amount of precision without having them take an IQ test. It's an interesting subject. I know nothing about it, so I'll Google it and I'll do some research and maybe I'll talk about it on another show, but I've never looked into this seriously. Let's keep listening.
Done here is substitute environmental factors for parental socioeconomic status, which is a much narrower category of variables. They simply add together parental education, income, and occupation, call that parental socioeconomic status, and plot it against IQ. And this is the graph they come up with.
That was what they were interested in. Let's see if knowing the income is better than knowing the IQ. And it turns out that the IQ contains a lot of information. This is all that this graph tells you.
The comparative roles of IQ and parental SES in determining whether young white adults are below the poverty line. It shows that people with low IQs are more likely to be in poverty than people whose parents had a low SES, and also the reverse. High IQ people are less likely to be in poverty than people whose parents had a high SES. Cognitive ability is more important than parental socioeconomic status in determining poverty, they say. But of course,
very interesting, and it's enough.
As we have seen, their consideration of environmental factors here is laughably narrow.
Well, here he is already sliding in a straw man. It's not environmental factors, since everything is an environmental factor in this whole comparison. Even the cognitive ability is an environmental factor from the perspective of the genes. We're not into the environment versus nature debate anymore. Just telling you that because it's misleading.
They only want to consider as valid things that fall under their definition of parental SES, and they ignore all the other relevant environmental factors.
Well, sometimes you need to ignore to weight two things specifically. That's what they've done.
What would happen to this graph if we also considered the various other things that Herrnstein and Murray leave out of their analysis? Now, I don't know how to do regression analysis, unfortunately, but the book Inequality by Design was written by some people who do know how to do regression analysis, and they do exactly what we're looking for here. Firstly, they recreate Herrnstein and Murray's calculations using their data. They then use the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth responses to add more environmental data to the analysis.
So here is going to suggest that the more you add, so instead of taking just income, you add to your analysis, well, income and home environment. And then you add, which community you were living in, your zip code. And then the thing is, you're going to add so many things that you will essentially contain the genes. If I tell you, would you be surprised if I told you that your zip code actually encodes your genes? Because it's true. If you give me a zip code and I have enough demographics data in the US, I could predict your genes. That's because communities tend to gather together. People live around communities of their own race. They live around their family. So ultimately, the zip code contains a part of predictive information about the genes. And the genes contain a part of predictive information about the IQ. So there's a point at which if you give me enough human data about you, like your zip code, the parents, the school you attended, etc., I can get to a pretty high-level prediction of your IQ. This is what's happening here. It's not that SES is better than IQ. It's that you have biased your analysis. You have fed the SES side of your equation with so much information that it probably knows IQ and more.
Their first updated graph changes parental SES to parental home environment, adding for consideration things like the number of siblings and whether the household has 2 parents. As we can see, AFQT score is still more important than parental home environment, but now the two are much closer together. Next up, they add community environment to home environment, considering the region where the respondent lived when they took the test and the school that they attended. Doing this, we see that AFQT score and social environment are now equal. Next, they add for consideration the number of years of education of the respondents to the survey. And by now, the AFQT score has slipped below the combined...
So that is absolutely fallacious. You can't do that. Because you're giving extra information to the point of giving the information of the other side. If you tell me your years of education, I know your IQ. I can make an educated guess about your IQ. So it is not true that this is SES beating IQ. It's SES plus extra information that may actually inform me about your IQ is better than just IQ. This is what it is. And this is exactly why Murray and Ernstine have not gone into these big, 50 variables analysis. It's that once you start injecting 50 variables, you don't know what's causing your increase in predictivity. And you don't know the intercorrelations between each of these variables. This is not worth doing. And certainly not for the small case that they were trying to do, which is, well, let's take one measure that is often used by sociologists, income, and let's compare it with cognitive performance. That is a very bad direction that Shaun went in. I will not review in detail the rest of the video, because the rest of the video is him arguing that the people who have been involved in this research and the bell curve itself is funded by Nazis. And I don't care. I don't care the source of the money. Ultimately, if you want to win an argument of fact, you need to present facts. We have not been presented with alternative facts today by Shaun. We have been presented with poking and prodding and I'm not sure and this could also be this. In the end, what survives? Literally everything. Literally everything of the bell curve survives this video. You might, at worst, if you join Shaun, today when you go to bed, you are unsure about the IQ of this country. You are unsure about the IQ of this country. And you are unsure about the IQ of this country. Do you realize how little of a dent in the armor was made by this video? He goes on to say that IQ does not come from genes. That relies on twin studies, which he has not commented on throughout this video. And so the argument that IQ is impacted by genes come from twin studies, separation at birth, and studying the same genes in different environment or different genes in different environment. And the answer from twin studies is that more than 50% of the variance of IQ in our society is gene related. I have not heard a single argument from Shaun contesting this, so it's just your opinion, dude. And when I pronounce my opinion, it is based on twin study. Philip L says it's bad geography. I don't know what you mean there. That guy S says Shaun should live in Somalia or bring them into his house. Yeah, I mean, it's possible. Maybe he will be moving to make the experiments and studies himself, since he's not satisfied with the data we've been obtaining. He also points to the fact that in the end he pokes at the bell curve and he says, our cognitive elite is not such elite, and he shows Donald Trump and he shows other figures that he considers are supposedly part of the cognitive elite but really aren't. Not a very good attack. First because the cognitive elite prediction of the bell curve, I don't defend it. So he could attack the idea and I just wouldn't care. But on top of it, there's no evidence that Donald Trump is not extremely intelligent. You can follow the CNN tendency and believe that the lack of charity in the treatment of CNN is enough to demonstrate his lack of intelligence, but the reality is that he has performed throughout his life in ways that demonstrate a talent that is undeniable, and it probably shows in an IQ test. He would have to do it to be sure, but I'm very I wouldn't bet on his lack of intelligence or his cognitive decline as CNN tries to make you believe. He also talks of the political arguments made by Charles Murray and this idea that going forward, we should care about the eugenic direction of our society. And here he uses the biggest fallacy of the video, where he assumes that our society is not eugenic. He says, we shouldn't want eugenic because Nazis, because Holocaust. But he's not realizing that it is our society that is eugenic, and Charles Murray merely comes as someone telling us we're eugenic in a bad way, and we should do better. We should do maybe less, maybe more natural, maybe less pressure, less institution control, less social welfare, but we are currently heavily manipulating our eugenic direction, and maybe we should let it go. That is the message of the bell curve, but Shaun treats this as, he wants to get us into a eugenic project. Well, not really. He wants to pull out of the current one. And as long as Shaun doesn't address this argument, which is the argument of the bell curve, it's explicit. When the bell curve says, we are favoring some mothers, but we are favoring the wrong mothers. It means that our society is eugenic, but that if we are to be eugenic, if there's no choice, we might as well at least choose the direction of it and at least make sure that we're not making ourselves into unintelligent creatures. He then presents, perhaps it's worth listening to this one, he presents Charles Murray as assuming a project of persuasion of mothers.
Take them as proof that environmental changes can produce positive effects, and then expand them, increase their funding, have equivalent programs for every stage.
So here you can see the eternal conclusion of the Marxists. It's like, instead of concluding that we should stop social welfare, you should conclude that we should do more social welfare. If we haven't fixed the difference, we should invest more to fix it. The problem is, it's a problem with no end. It's the infinitely suffering patient that you're plugging onto one more machine on every day to keep him alive a little longer. There is a limit to what we can demand from the state, to how dependent we must tolerate our own existence to be. And Charles Murray is just saying we've reached that point. We've reached that point where we are helping people too much.
Of school life. Any later diminished effects are proof that we aren't trying hard enough, not that what we're trying to do is impossible. Nearly every policy...
You see, this is the first time I hear it explicitly, but it's the Marxist assumption that this entire discussion is about what's possible. It would be possible for these nations to have equal IQs to ours? Well, to that I would say, Shaun, I largely agree. It would be possible. There's no laws of physics that keeps South Africa from having 105 IQ. It would be possible, the same way purple ponies are possible. The question is, how much investment do you need to get there? Is it worth getting there? Will the world let you get there? Or will the people consent to even get there? Do you imagine the severe Marxist program of control and invasions of private liberty that is needed to get there? And is it worth it? I think we don't disagree that it's possible. It's possible. Give me a biodome environment where I can give electric shocks to people and hold their eyes open in front of a cinema, shooting them information. Maybe you can get there, but I don't want to do it. I don't want to be that evil. But you do.
The proposal in the bell curve has this sort of alternative explanation. One of their proposals for dissuading low IQ mothers from having children is to stop the welfare programs that support them. But as we know, richer people tend to have fewer children, and birth rates are lower in countries with comprehensive welfare programs. Making these women poorer will not make them have fewer children, and besides...
This is fallacious. There is a point, there is the second law of thermodynamics, and no matter how it could be the case in our society, it's true. The richer women are making less babies, so poverty is associated with more baby making. But that's merely because we are in an environment that sustains this lifestyle and that helps through welfare. If you reduce the social welfare programs to absolute zero, the poor are not going to be able to make much babies, or they're going to die young, they're going to have diseases. If we weren't there to save them, the poor wouldn't be reproducing that much. And that you can read At Our Wits' End by Edward Dutton on this. The poor of the 19th century, for example, where there were very low social programs or not at all, the poor of the 19th century were eliminated. They were sustaining high amounts of diseases, of malnutrition, and they weren't succeeding at reproducing as much as the rich. So it's only a recent thing that social welfare is so good and productivity is so high that the poor are capable of beating the rich on the number of baby produced. That is it. I believe that I have addressed all of the points. Oh yeah, and further he was like, how can you be sure that you will convince poor women of not making babies? We won't. The point is, if you don't give them money and they are in such a state of poverty that they know that their next baby will be malnourished, they will either be convinced or they won't, but in any case, it will reduce their reproductive power. It will reduce their ability to compete with the rich, and eventually the system will self-correct. You don't have to persuade. If you stop helping, you stop favoring certain behaviors and certain directions of society. So, those are my comments. Shaun has done a nice try, but too little and too pointy. We exit this video with not the conviction that the bell curve is fundamentally wrong, but simply with doubts that Shaun has decided to seed in our mind. But even if we were to acknowledge all points made in this video, it is just not sufficient to make a significant dent to the theory of the bell curve. The bell curve is a book that gets interested in the description of cognitive structure in society in America, and it does it well. It overstates some of its cases, and some of its predictions, I believe, are absolutely wrong. But it's a nice focus. It's like you put the cognitive glasses on your eyes and you see the world. You see the world. What happens if I really care about intelligence? And you see a lot of things that have consequences for politics, for the size of the state, for criminality, for race, for identity, for boundaries, for nations, for borders. And none of that has been successfully questioned. Now, Shaun evidently disagrees with the direction that Charles Murray wants to take. Charles Murray is a libertarian, so he wants to take us in a direction where we are not dependent anymore of the government. But Shaun doesn't make an evolutionary argument. Shaun doesn't present an alternative scenario. If the bell curve is wrong about how the current state of welfare essentially favors more welfare dependence in the next generation, what is Shaun's hypothesis? That we will constantly be in a Flynn effect, an infinite one? What is the end to it? What is the maximum of this system? When is it that the ever-increasing curve of intelligence bumps onto the limits of reality, the second law of thermodynamics, or whatever you like? There is no alternative theory. It has to stop, and it has already begun to stop. And inevitably, the forces of the state will result in more dependence, more recruitment of taxes, more appropriation of wealth by the poor for the purpose of their own reproduction from the rich. We are in a society that is headed toward the left, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. It's an evolutionary reality, and I haven't heard what I would like. If we were engaged with a human being who is honest and who's genuinely engaged in a path of questioning, of finding the truth, what Shaun would do is he would tell us what do you agree with, Shaun? Do you think that evolution applies to humans? Do you think that certain capacities are disappearing from the human population? Do you think that helping too much ends up having dysgenic effect in the future in general, even if you want to deny this specific case of intelligence? In general, if you give free food to birds intergenerationally, you literally make a pot of infinite peanuts for birds. Do you think that we're going to reach a point at which the birds will stop being able to capture their own prey? At which they will assume that the peanuts will always be there? Do you think at some point they may even lose their capacity to fly? Because they stay around the peanut pot and they will continually be fed and there won't be maintenance pressure. Do you understand these concepts? As I exit this video, I'm not sure he does. I'm not sure he engaged with the content here in a genuine path of understanding. ZP Taz says, thank you for this very comprehensive response to Shaun. You deserve a lot of donations for this alone. Well, thank you so much. And if you want to support the show in a stable fashion, we have, of course, Patreon, we have Subscribe Stars, and we also have recently new Project 2. Already 5 supporters have joined us there. It's a new platform, Patreon alternative, hosted by LA-based comedian, a guy who has been censored in other ways, and so he's creating this platform, and it's the most efficient way to send money, really, to me, because I'm only giving 5% of my amount to new project. They are very kind. They take less than Patreon, less than Subscribe Star. So if you want to support me in a continuous fashion, that's one good way. Hypocrite says, Shaun would have made a good criminal defense lawyer, but a crap scientist. Yeah, I don't even know if liar would apply here. Nutrum says, enjoyed the Spencer show the other day, but missed it live. Yes, it was great. I'm trying to see if we can get Richard more often, perhaps including in around the time of Christmas. We'll see if he can come. We're trying to get a big Christmas night. The Christmas program will be absolutely insane. We're already stacked in the schedule. Greg Johnson will be coming on the 24th. On the 25th, we have Christmas special with maybe 4 or 5 guests. On the 23rd, we have Christmas dinner with Mama JF. And we have the New Year special on the 31st, where we will celebrate and count to the New Year. It's going to be absolutely insane. You don't want to miss it. Much love, everyone. Sleep well. And tomorrow is a solo show. We'll be looking at the news or anything of interest that develops tomorrow. Sheen Lantern says, also Liberia was never colonized. Yeah. Liberia, Ethiopia, all of these islands where you have black populations that have been stable and non-colonized for many decades. There's lots of examples. Much love, everyone. Sleep well, and I will see you tomorrow.